Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old Fourth Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
This morning, I have the opportunity to speak with Dr. Anthony Tony Lemieux. Dr. Tony, is Dr. Tony good enough for you? I just want to make sure.
That works. Thank you, Ron.
So Dr. Lemieux is an associate professor of communication at Georgia State University and an investigator with START. That is the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism. That's got to be one hell of a holiday party. Anyway, I started before we even dove into the conversation on the show today, just by asking Dr. Lemieux, Dr. Tony, how he's doing. And he said, fine. And then I said, come on, man. You're a really smart guy. You know a lot of what's going on in the world. You cannot be possibly fine. And then he started having a full-fledged conversation about what's not going right. And I said, wait, we have a show to do. So here you are. Thank you for joining me this morning on the show. I appreciate that.
My pleasure to be here.
So the interesting thing is I reached out to you last week to discuss the J6 pardons and the sort of implications and ramifications that can come from that. Just the silent messaging, the not-so-subtle messaging, the pulling of security detail for former Trump inner circle officials. The message seems pretty clear to me. You ally yourself with Donald Trump. You go to the wall for him, run through the wall for him, and he will have your back. You cross him, and he'll leave you twisting in the wind for Iran to deal with. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about the pardons of the J6 criminals. There's bipartisan derision for that, and we've seen that on the Sunday talk shows and throughout the weekend, punditry. But obviously, there's no repercussion for that, and no one Republican's going to stand up and try and make noise about that, or seek political. Hey, if that were a Joe Biden pardon, of course, they would be screaming bloody murder and impeachment hearings left and right. But talk to me a little bit about that subtle messaging that other folks out there in the woods doing their militia things suddenly might feel a little more emboldened to act on Donald Trump's needs and whims as he's president now with that sort of pulpit.
Well, we're well past subtlety here, right? There's nothing left to interpret. This is, I think very clearly what this message sends. And even in things that have been, where I think it's been fascinating is to watch the kind of dissonance reduction, right? That these sort of ideas or attitudes or values that people have are sort of in conflict, and how does that get reduced? And there's a few things we see going on here. One of them that really is interesting to me is that there is a sort of revisionist history happening here, like a downgrading on and who did what. And this is after extensive investigations and going through the legal system. And so think about all of the effort and work that went into making these cases and to really demonstrating what people did and the intention and all of that. And it's been thrown out the window. And to your point, the message is you can do anything up to and including assaulting police officers. Now think about this. One of the things that was so important to this constituency, purportedly, was support for law enforcement.
Right.
But here we have this big asterisk, right? So they had to square that circle. And so I think one of the things that really stands out is exactly as you started the conversation with, that if you do things in service of Donald Trump, you will be rewarded for it, recognized for it, protected from the ramifications from it. And that is a really, really dangerous sign. And thinking about who some of the key players are, let's just take the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. These are groups that have envisioned themselves sort of as like a tip of the spear, or the vanguard of, in this sort of strange way, have now had some degree of validation. And so that to me is, probably one of the especially more concerning aspects of all of this is that, when he told them before, stand back and stand by, and now this, the people who need to be hearing these messages, believe me, are hearing them. And that's concerning.
Is it just me, or do these folks that are coming out of the prisons look like comic book villains too? Like the guy that came out with the eye patch. I'm a little terrified, but in some respects. I kid a little bit, but in some respects, you look at his inner circle and it's like, you can't draw better comic book villains than these people. I feel like I'm living in something that is the start of a Batman flick, for crying out loud. We're with Dr. Tony Lemieux here at Georgia State University. Something else that you mentioned before we went on the air was the pulling of funding for little things like the global aid freeze that is now going to cut the salaries to a lot of the folks who are working in prison and camp guards responsible for securing ISIS militants throughout the world. That can't be good either.
Well, I was even thinking of it more specifically from just like the freeze on funding for the, research enterprise as a small example, but this benefits everyone, regardless of party. I mean, this is things like basic health and science research, drug discovery, engineering. Like, you think about everything that really, we have built in terms of systems and institutions is now sort of, let's hit the pause button. And that is really concerning. And I don't know that maybe people really voted for this with the intention of this happening, but I don't think the full ramifications of how it's going to affect real people in their real and daily lives is going to be fully known until it shakes through. But it is, concerning. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? That's one area. It's going to be devastating to higher education if it really is, delayed for, well, any length of time is really problematic, but anything longer than that can cause just massive problems, and unnecessarily so.
Well, we're faced with this reality politically for the next 2 years at minimum, and I get a general sense. In fact, I'm hearing it a lot from prominent left-wing pundits, even from The Daily Show last night. Jon Stewart sort of imploring Democrats to do something, and the political reality is there's not much they can do except try and convince Senate Republicans to not confirm nominees. But my theory is if the DUI candidate that was just appointed to the Secretary of Defense, if he can get through, Kash Patel can get through, it's just about RFK. Anybody else is going to get rubber stamped. So Democrats are sort of having to sit back and wait, but maybe not making enough noise for a lot of these folks. But talk to me a little bit about the sort of messaging that even that sort of quiet non-compliance sends to the American public. Do you get a general sense of, oh my God, the majority of this country did not vote for this, a very slim majority, but still the plurality won.
Right.
What, do you get a general sense in the American, just from what you see, I don't know if you peruse social media or you have conversations, do you get a general sense that we're just kind of all strapped in and dealing with the 2 to 4 years that we're facing and there's just not much that can be done?
Well, I mean, there's always things that can be done, but I think, to go back to the sort of original point, I mean, and I know people sort of on all sides of the political spectrum. I work with people on all sides of the political spectrum. I have family and friends on, and it's sometimes hard to, again, square that circle to see, like, what is it that is the more sort of salient, things that are driving why people sort of land where they land, candidate-wise, policy-wise, or otherwise. And I think, that one of the biggest challenges we have is that people act so surprised when, like, their preferred candidate doesn't win or gets votes, or like, how could you support that?
Yeah.
And it sort of depends on which aspect of it you're looking at. But to your question about what the Democrats are going to, be able to do, and especially with the nominees, I mean, clearly not much of anything, right? They can't. And, I've not been a real fan of the two-party system my entire life, and political sort of awareness has really, I think galvanized that viewpoint. Like, we have just sort of all of these people. I think there's a lot of people, in the middle, somewhere in the middle. They might not agree on financial things. They might not agree on social things, but they can kind of see a North Star, right? Like things maybe we could be talking a shared reality. That would be nice too, right?
Right.
And so the Democrats come in and pick particular issues and points, and one might look at that and say, really, like, that's what you want to make the big issue? That's what you want to do? And the Republicans do it too, right? So we're sitting here and we see, nominees come in, and again, only test is absolute fealty, right?
Yep.
That's what's going to get them nominated. That's what's going to get them on the stage. And then if anyone else gets crosswise of that, see how that's going to work out for them.
Yeah.
The Democrats have to line up against them, but what Republicans are going to be able to do that and not get drummed out, not get primaried. And, so I think it's going to be a while, and a lot of people whose real qualification for the position is their absolute loyalty and fealty.
We're with Dr. Tony Lemieux, professor of communication at Georgia State University and investigator with START, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism. Obviously, there are folks who are frustrated with Democrats for not doing anything or not being able to do anything, being powerless to do anything in just the first week of the Trump second presidency. But also there's a little immobility on the right, and some culpability for their not doing anything, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I wanted to bring up the opportunity for those on the right who dare to speak out against Donald Trump could be primaried on the right, but the immobility by the Democratic Party on the left could lead to primarying on their side of the spectrum as well. I could conceive of a situation where a lot of Democrats who feel like they're safely in their seats are going to get primaried by people as well who are driven to an anger to act, and we could have a pendulum effect, if not as equal, in some ways just as radical to the left and again that's a polarity problem that I think the country may not be ready to reckon with, but that's another question for another. I want to get back to your specialty here. We're talking about terrorism and reaction to terrorism. There's an obvious cult-like behavior that belongs to the base Trump voter, but that is not even, I would say, the majority of the Republican Party base. It's just that the party is afraid of losing that large chunk of their base to something else. You mentioned this being a two-party system sort of country, and I sort of think there's probably room for four parties at the end of the day if we could ever get to that point. But Republicans have lost control of their own party to a minority of their party. And that's not nothing to sneeze at. That's not nothing to disregard, is it? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is there hope that once this Trump fever breaks, that the Republican Party will come back to being something closer to sanity?
Well, any hope for that, I think, is on an indefinite pause, if not gone, right? Like, I think the transition is all but complete, and I think if you look at people who are pretty, very conservative in policy, across social, fiscal, like even people like Mitt Romney, people who have been drummed out, essentially, persona non grata. Adam Kinzinger is another one that stands out. You think about some of the people, and so anyone who has gotten crosswise has been, negated, drummed out, thrown out, not being on the, Trump train, so to speak. And I will say, on the Democrat side, just for, sort of balance here, everyone was sort of going and towing the line there as well, in the sense of, we were going to keep Biden in that, role to run again. And no one really challenged that until the 11th hour, and it was too little too late. And so, both of the sort of political sides of the spectrum, in a sense, have a real sort of bias towards towing the line in some really harmful ways here. And I think it was on full display. But to take it back to extremism, which I think is the more apt context here, if we think about extremism, where one group sees the other as a threat that must be dealt with, like their success is going to relate to or cause our failure. J.M. Berger's a colleague and a friend, has this really great working definition that takes it out of a political spectrum. So it's not a left-right issue. It's not a liberal-conservative issue. Just at the face value, it really gets to the us-them aspect of it, and that we have to harm them or get them out of the way in order to be successful. And that rhetoric is always problematic. But in this last campaign season, it was everywhere, right? It was you won't have a country left. It was, and by the way, again, last fall I was teaching an extremism class, which made for some really interesting, conversation along the way. But on the Democrat side of it, the extremism showed up as, hey, you got this guy who's coming in. He's going to be an authoritarian. You're not going to have a country left either, but for different reasons. So you saw this whole sort of really polarizing rhetoric, pushing people towards these positions that the other, whoever that other was that they were aligned against, was an existential threat to the health, future, and well-being of this country. And, and that that really, it's all around. I mean, people have a hard time talking to each other, finding and there is going to be shared common ground somewhere. Now, if part of that is, you don't recognize me as a human being, that's where we part ways and draw the line, right? Sure. That's not worth validating. But there's a lot in between. that sort of level of extreme. But it really is, I think, we have seen now the manifestation of what this results in. And now, you see somebody feel like emboldened and mandated, even though we're talking, about 31% of the popular vote.
Right. But at the same time, we talk about that sharp divide, but there were a lot of prominent Republicans who were out there campaigning with Kamala Harris. To me, I felt like that was much to her chagrin for folks who are like wildly to the left of center, who looked at an Adam Kinzinger or a Liz Cheney going out and campaigning, stumping with Kamala Harris, and that had to be disdainful to some of them too. I literally thought, I was like, well, if we've got prominent Republicans, the Cheneys, for crying out loud. I mean, 15 years ago, they were as vilified as any last name in the political lexicon for those who were left of center. And the Cheneys were out there campaigning for Kamala Harris. I literally thought, I was like, this could be a landslide. I didn't expect the result we got.
Well, in a way, that was too little too late. They had already been marginalized by their party. So who are they really speaking to? Like, what voter who's going to seriously consider Harris is really, really that fixated on what somebody like Liz Cheney says, right? That's not. So I think that, part of the question is for those of us sort of MSNBC, it's like, oh, see, this does it. This proves it. It's like, well, so what? Who is she really speaking to that's going to be persuadable, that's going to be influenced and hear it? Because anyone who heard what she was saying critique-wise almost certainly already knew it and believed it. They didn't need to hear it from her. They knew it years ago. She came around to it. Yeah. So that's the whole sort of other piece of that information asymmetry that we see, that people are like shocked by the results, but it's like, well, not really. Like, to be effective in being that crossover candidate and really overlook a lot of problematic aspects Harris came in with. Yeah. Coming in late, no primary. Right. She didn't do particularly well in the primary when there actually was one.
That's right.
Anyone could have looked at this and said, wow, we got a problem here. And I think they did. They tried their best, but it wasn't enough and it wasn't effective. And I don't think there's, given where we are in terms of the representation, I don't think there's going to be much that's going to be different in the next few years because they just don't have now the numbers to do anything, other than try to block certain things along the way.
I'm with Dr. Anthony Lemieux. He's an associate professor of communication at Georgia State University and an investigator with START, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism, Response to Terrorism. Is there a point in human history where a faction of a political movement in a country got exactly what they wanted, and I guess we could say f***ed around and found out that, whoa, this is not what they wanted, and it blew up in their faces spectacularly. Is there some sort of litmus we can look back to in history that points to something like this happening before and what happened as a result?
Well, in the historical context, I'm sure there are. The ones I think about are the ones that relate to asymmetric conflict, and things that sort of lend themselves to escalation and the kind of harm that ensues. And, terrorism is one form, genocide is another. And so this gets at the sort of extreme cases that there's this group responsible for all our problems. And if only they were gone, things would be so much better. And they give it a try, right? And you've seen this now too many times to mention, and it's always horrific. It's always ineffective in terms of doing anything except for causing massive harm and misery and economic collapse and every other kind of way a society can fall apart. And so I hope, we're very far off of that. But my biggest concern in the red flags, I've been studying, genocide and terrorism and extremism my entire career. And I should, by the way, correct, I've been a full professor for a while, and I've been at this for longer than even that bio might suggest that you saw online. And that, to me, those are the biggest red flags, right? That there is now this sense that there is there's some other, and we put a finger on different versions of what it is. We see it in attacks on trans gender. We see it in attacks on, immigrants of various stripes. We see it as attacks on our political foes, like people we don't necessarily agree with. There's a whole range of it. Some are more extreme and harmful than others. And that to me is where I get especially concerned, because one of the things that happens in these kind of conflicts as they grow is the sort of increase in escalation of attacks on marginalized populations and groups, and without impunity. And that's one of the things that these pardons, to go back to the thing, that we had touched base on last week, what these pardons suggest is that there is a window of potential impunity for violence. And when you start to put all those pieces together, and you're a student of the history of these kinds of conflicts, the alarm bells are ringing loud, clear, repeatedly, with more intensity, because it's literally happening around us. We're seeing the escalation of the rhetoric. We're seeing an escalation of the various acts. We're seeing people move apart. So the polarization, I think, that you mentioned before, is a critical piece of this. And so, yeah, I'm quite concerned about all of these things, and for those reasons.
And we have so many guns in this country. So it's literally
right.
sparking near a powder keg.
Well, that's the other piece of this, right? Motivation times capability.
Yeah.
And we see there's a lot of motivation, and we also know there's a lot of capability for substantial harm.
Yeah.
And that, again, is the kind of thing that, people like me and the work we do is going to keep us up at night, because we know when you put those things together, and not just, I think everybody knows that, right? But from a research perspective, we can tell you how, why, when, and give you examples in history that it has happened. Doesn't mean we can predict the future, right? But it means that it puts us in a range where that future that heretofore might have been unimaginable here is suddenly becoming a little more imaginable than is comfort.
That brings me to my next point. We've spent so much of the 2024 campaign speaking rhetorically, evoking Hitler, Germany, Nazi Party, yada, yada, yada. And now it feels like folks are hesitant to draw that comparison because of the rebuke that they'll get, whether it's intellectually or geopolitically. We've sat here and talked for like nearly half an hour, and we haven't even brought that comparison up. But how apt is the comparison and what we're seeing here? We're withdrawing from the World Health Organization. There's supposed to be a year run up to that, but nope, we're not even, like, the CDC's not allowed to talk to WHO anymore. What could go wrong with that? We only, pulled a pandemic response unit and had a global pandemic, hit us in the face months later. How apt is that comparison?
I think it's, excuse me, within reason. It is dangerously applicable in ways we need to address, right? I think, with the kind of the campaigning, the rhetoric, the dismantling of institutions, the sort of surrounding yourself with people who are going to do your bidding and nothing else. There are a lot of really problematic comparisons here that I think one could reasonably make. And that is really uncomfortable, right? And even this whole debacle with Musk and his Nazi salute last week, and
so we're clear that was a Nazi salute, right?
Look, if he not only did it once, he did it twice. He did it in a very characteristic way. Now you've got sort of in the channels, well, no, it was Roman, and no, it wasn't. He was throwing his heart to the crowd. Oh, is that what it was? Because, and one maybe not need to look too much further than the German response, which is like, dude, that's what that was. Let's
well, and he's out there campaigning. He's out there campaigning with an ultra right German political movement now.
Yeah, and look, and this is part of the problem, right? There's enough of the plausible deniability that is they try to sort of bake into these, comments and speculations and gestures and all these other sort of examples, are sort of in that space where it's like, did they really mean that? Is it? But the people who need to hear it the way I think it was meant heard it that way. And that's the other piece of it, is like, which part of your audience are you trying to reach, and what are you trying to convey to them when you do that? And so, this is the kind of thing that I think when you want to make that particular comparison and example, You look at the totality of the situation, you look at the sort of demonization and dehumanization of outgroups that's sort of part of the ascendancy. You look at the sort of gathering of social and economic problems and challenges that are attendant there. You look at the consolidation of power around one leader who can sort of report back on their struggles, so to speak. You look at the way that the sort of institutions and the guardrails are systematically removed and disregarded.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at all the people who are going to try to carry water around, and then you look at the people who sort of sit around and stay silent, maybe even benefit a little bit from it. People who sit there and say, well, our institutions are falling apart, but my retirement, my IRA looks okay. It's like, oh, okay, really? I mean, sure, I got some Bitcoin. That's been great. Holy cow, what about the rest of everything, So it's sort of putting all those pieces together, and that's where you can make that example. But I think to really get at that better, you'd have to have a historian and a specialist who can talk to more of the dimensions of that comparison. But at least on a couple of the key ones, we have enough to get us sort of starting that conversation, at least uncomfortable as it is, and trying to think about what can we do collectively to sort of take that temperature down and just sort of bring things to a place where we are not, at a precipice of potential conflict that we really don't. I don't think we would fully understand the ramifications of.
I kind of understand why some people are looking at Democrats and trying to, poke them with the stick, do something. But I also understand the political realities that Democrats are sort of powerless to do much in the current form. What I'm wondering is, at what point is the Donald Trump presidency a lame duck presidency, so that Republicans who finally, like Mitch McConnell's finally starting to notice that he has a soul again. And I mean, he's at death's door, so, big whoop. But at some point in time, are we going to start seeing more Republicans peel off in Washington and throughout the rest of the country in state offices to start to finally try and, undo or at least slow down some of this slow roll into what appears to be kind of fascistic? I mean, people are afraid to say it, but the guy promised to be an emperor or to be a dictator on day one, but we're more than a week in, and he's still flinging out executive orders and edicts as if suddenly that's something that their party approves of. When Obama was president, they were screaming on Fox News left and right about any executive order. So when are Republicans going to start to see the lame duckness of this and start to reclaim some grasp of the reins?
Well, who knows, right? In terms of, I've given up trying to predict the future, but what I can, suggest is that when some of these implementations hit close to home and cut close to the bone, when things that were supporting of a lifestyle, like any of the economic aspects, which now we've got so many things that are sort of paused or. When any of the consequences, for instance, of the raids that we're seeing unfold, where now you've got people scared to leave the house and go to work and do, you've got so many things that are now going to start to ripple. And those are going to hit locally. Like, I don't think people have a full awareness of the benefits they get, from the federal government,
right?
And that their that their representatives work to try to secure. And when that's all gone, that's going to hit Republican, Democrat, and everybody in between, and everybody not affiliated with it. That's just going to hit everywhere. And that might be a moment. But again, one possibility is they say, hey, wait a minute, this is too much. This is wrongheaded. Or the other possibility is they say, well, we're not doing enough to root out the sources and the root causes of these problems, so let's double down. And that's the other possibility here that I think is a really disconcerting one, because there's going to be some economic fallout. Thinking about even like with the latest bird flu egg price thing, and now just think about all these little sort of things that are happening. And if part of your campaign was on rising prices and inflation, and now you're sort of seeing things implemented that are going to, increase prices of things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now who's to blame for that?
Yeah.
And so how that blame gets ascribed is going to be really important in all this, because if people see it as the direct result of these, edicts and executive orders and policies that have been thrown in, that could push it one way. If they see it as a vindication of those policies because, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet kind of logic, that'll lead to something potentially different. So all that to say, who knows?
Well, I liken Donald Trump to being a mob boss because I think that's how he speaks. I think he speaks in retribution. I think he speaks in intimidation. We now have Pete Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense. We're soon to have Kash Patel, who will be head of the FBI. Those are two major institutions to wield some intimidation and retribution through. So there has to be a palpable fear for anybody, left or right, to dare speak up and speak against anything that he touts. Am I wrong? Yeah. Am I reading too far into that? Maybe.
No, I think that is one of the potential things that people will do. They'll try to, sort of keep their head down and toe the line, and understandably so. You have families to think about and take care of. Like I get it. There's a lot of reasons why people act as they do in these kinds of situations. The thing that I think is interesting, again, coming back to my perspective in, higher education, is when you have a vice president who's been on record, speaking about professors as the enemy, even if in jest, which it kind of wasn't, if you listen to the context of it, that's a problem, right? There's this sort of us versus them piece of it that's sort of encapsulated in all aspects of life. And then with the Department of Defense, I mean, let's, sort of see where this falls. I mean, that's part of what we're left with doing anyways. But from my perspective, I've had substantial research support through the Department of Defense, really to try to keep our country safer, to understand our adversaries, particularly in the context of terrorism and extremism. I've got, some active proposals right now that look at the sort of unfolding areas of conflict in terms of nation-state adversaries and some recent developments in the Arctic, for instance. So there's a number of places that research is, has nothing to do with partisan anything, has everything to do with all of our security. And yet to see it sort of cast that way, it's like, what are you talking about? Like, that is not, as educators, as researchers, we are all rowing in the direction of safety, security, prosperity, and integrity. Like we're not at odds here, but it doesn't make for political hay unless you can get painted that way. And that's the part that's just really alarming to me, because it's just so disingenuous.
We're on with Dr. Tony Lemieux, who is a professor of communication here in Atlanta at Georgia State University, also an investigator with START, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism, and that includes domestic terrorism, which is why we're having a conversation in the aftermath of the pardoning of the J6 rioters by Donald Trump on day one in office. I feel as if Donald Trump is something of a useful tool to our adversaries who wish to dismantle our way of life, because he is that wedge that can kind of be driven between factions in this country. Anybody who's a student of history knows that the Soviet Union and Russia and now China, North Korea, they know that our divisions along cultural lines, especially race, or where our weakest points are, where we can be divided. And I feel as if he's become sort of that useful tool to do that. I mean, we're looking at the uprising of the white male afraid of becoming the marginalized minority that has long been at the business end of marginalization and fearful of being that themselves. I mean, we've seen flips. Joe Rogan used to be a Bernie Sanders progressive. Mark Zuckerberg, really smart guy. Someone, who is married to a minority himself. Mitch McConnell's married to a minority, for crying out loud. And yet, this uprising of the white male, we've been saying, oh, it's the last gasp. I don't know that it is. It feels like there's a reclamation happening that has been sort of joysticked from outside our borders to bring us to where we are. And to me, that is a grave national threat. And I'm sure that's something that you've had to touch on at some point in time.
Absolutely. I have a project right now, supported by the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, where we are looking at not only what's happening sort of in state-based media systems and adversarial relationships, but also proto states. It's like, Taliban's closer to a state now than they were when we started this work, and then some of the emergent groups, some of the actors in the accelerationist space. And if you think about where that kind of ideology lies, it's really to say that there are divisions that are exploitable, that there's a society that is so corrupt that it has to just come down, and that there are actors that are trying to foment that conflict, to get people to be at odds with each other and to really increase that by any means necessary. So whatever the wedge issue, could be guns, it could be abortion, it could be gay and trans rights, it could be race, it could be books in the schools. It could be, it doesn't matter as long as it causes division and divisiveness and gets heated and becomes increasingly problematic. Because if the goal is to tear at the fabric of society, then that sort of doesn't necessarily have a particular angle it has to take. It has to just, poke the right bear in the right place and cause that sort of divisiveness to come up. And so, we look at the sort of coverage of what kinds of events get coverage and how. There's a lot of conversation lately about mis and disinformation and fact checking and this, and that's all important. And that's a whole conversation for another time. But there's also a way that something can be perfectly truthful and accurate, just very decontextualized, kind of like, if you take a magnifying glass and focus the sun on a particular point, you start to cause it to smoke a little bit and maybe even catch fire, because what you're doing is highlighting one piece, and maybe it's a very unflattering truth, And so that would pass any of these conversations about what's technically misinformation. It's truthful. Like, you could fact check it all day long. It might be a fact. It's just a decontextualized and unflattering one. And so there's so many parts of that conversation that I think, and that's Trump may be part of that in terms of, how some of the issues he raises, they can kind of hammer into. But truthfully, that transcends any political party. That is a much longer game. It's sort of a national issue, national emergency, I would say, in that there are, adversarial and malign actors really seeking to cause the divisiveness. We see it in bot farms. We see it exacerbated in social media. I mean, that's been sort of a vector through which, the problems can be exacerbated and quickly. So, there's a lot of great uses of social media. I've been a user, a proponent, investor, all those things, from the outset, right? I see that potential, but there's also the ugly underside that it has created. And I think we've all experienced it. Read any comment section. And then, what's a good thought exercise for the listeners?
All right.
Take a look at a comment section and try to, take a look at some of those, commenters' profiles and just see, do you think they're a real person?
Yeah.
Do you think there's really somebody back behind that? Or, or maybe it's been cultivated
I find
to
myself
look like a real person?
I find myself doing that on Twitter X actually a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things. And once you start to get a sense of that, you're like, whoa, this might be a bigger problem than we think.
But this is, to his credit, this is one of the things that I think the Biden administration was trying to work on. They were literally trying to develop a disinformation, misinformation committee or subcommittee or something along those lines. And that got shouted down by the right. I think we know why. Anyone who, again, is a student of American history or communications, as you are, we know that there has been this misinformation, disinformation mechanism that has developed over time, from religious radio to talk radio, now to cable news, and now we're into the podcast spectrum. Any sort of government entity that starts looking at disinformation and misinformation is going to find it.
Yeah, and I think if it gets positioned as you're censoring conservative voices, which is how that conversation unfolded to get us where we are. Well, like, no, that's not what's happening, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is kind of patently absurd. And what I think there was a failure to recognize is that there are positions that might lean into what someone agrees with. Freedom of speech is one thing. Freedom of speech on a privately owned platform or one that's investor supported is another.
Well, I
And
keep waiting.
unfortunately,
I keep waiting for the ego to step in, especially with right wing media folks, to understand. Listen, you're being manipulated, and you're being manipulated not just from within, but from without as well. And at what point do they have that realization and pull the plug on it, or have a mea culpa, self-awareness moment?
if the stuff that they're hearing and seeing speaks to, there's a sort of bias in motivated cognition, selective information. And if some of the things that, are channels, even if they're disingenuous sources, they might be a message that we agree with or connect with. And this is something I always I have this conversation whenever we're talking about this. It's like, if there's anything that you see that punches you, that gives you that feeling in the gut that you're like, yeah, check it, watch it, because that's what it's designed to do. Like, I don't care what, like what your political preference, like this, it transcends all of that noise. This is that there is sort of this emotional outrage that when we feel and experience that and feel like our need to exercise our inner keyboard warrior and jump in the fray, it's like, don't stop. And I mean, I'm human, right? I see it. We all see it. But I think, and that's one of the things that when people know that they're trying to be deceived and manipulated, and particularly when there's an adversarial state aspect to it, like that might be a way to address it. But unfortunately, a lot of the people in the roles of trying to, identify and thwart that problem, I go to a conference called Terrorism and Social Media and some of those sort of things. I was at Facebook headquarters for a meeting on security through the Global Internet Forum for Countering Terrorism a while back. I mean, this is what I do, right? A lot of these people are colleagues and friends and former students who work in this space. And a lot of them find themselves looking for employment, and they were doing really good work in terms of content moderation. And some of that is
gone.
This is a whole other set of conversations, but like the things that this links to, and really awful content that you wouldn't want to see as a person, sort of decency on social media. You sure wouldn't want your kids looking at and being exposed to. And you wouldn't want your brand advertised anywhere near it, not even in the same ballpark, And so, these are the kind of things that were really what was in the crosshairs. And yet, somehow, in effect, it got presented as a quote unquote attack on conservative voices and a, suppression of freedom of speech, which is totally a bizarre frame, but it's stuck. And so, here we are. And unmoderated, and all the tech bros at the inauguration. I mean, we sort of, you see everybody lining up there. That is not coincidental.
Yeah, the broligarchy, they're now called. Dr. Anthony Tony Lemieux, professor of communication, Georgia State University, and an investigator with the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism. Listen, I'm going to charge myself and the rest of the audience to go have a good day after this heady conversation. So I'm going to tell you to do the same thing. Thank you so much for joining me today and having this very in-depth discussion on The Ron Show. We appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.